DeMarcco Hellams can be an enforcer in the Falcons secondary, but is that type of safety a fit in today's NFL?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Birddogs. Go to birddogs.com/lockedonnfl, and they'll throw in a free custom Birddogs Yeti-style tumbler with every order. And guys, we thank each and every one of you that makes this illustrious podcast your first listen. And of course, shout out to the everydayers checking out this podcast every single day. Follow in their footsteps by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we are continuing our breakdown of the Falcons 2023 draft class with 7th round safety DeMarcco Hellams. We're almost there. Right. There was a point in May where I sat here and thought, oh, I'll be able to get these done by June 1st. And here we are 2 weeks later, and then probably get the Javon Gwynn 3 weeks later. So we'll see how that goes. But let's break down what I saw on film watching DeMarcco Hellams 7 games of his from this past year at Alabama. But let's start talking about his background. Grew up in the DC area, was high school teammates with Chase Young and DJ Turner, another high pick in this past year's draft. Wound up being a very successful high school player, playing wide receiver, safety, was a 4-star recruit, recruited by top programs, ultimately chose Alabama, of course, and wound up being a starter a full-time starter going into his junior year, started the last 2 years alongside guys that were Brian Branch and Jordan Battle, probably a little overshadowed by those guys. And it kind of goes back to something we talked with Jimmy Stein of Locked On Bama, where even though DeMarcco Hellams was this 4-star recruit, similar to Branch and Battle, both 4-star recruits, like he kind of fits as kind of this underdog guy, this kind of gritty blue collar guy that kind of worked his way through, even though like he would have gone to any of these other programs that recruited him and would have been a quote unquote star in them. But that's just kind of the nature of Alabama with, their talent level and their recruiting level. And we know because he played at Alabama, he's a well-coached player. Alabama has had a pipeline, as we talked about with Jimmy Stein of Locked On Bama earlier this summer, has had a pipeline of good, solid safeties and corners entering the NFL. Hellams was able to wind up being a Senior Bowl invite. He did get a couple of days of practice in before he had to exit due to a concussion. There is a coaching connection between DeMarcco Hellams and current members of the Falcons coaching staff. Nick Perry, who's currently the Falcons assistant wide receivers coach, was a former Alabama safety, was a graduate assistant and analyst for Alabama the last couple of years before joining the Falcons staff. So he overlapped with Hellams there. Dave Huxtable is currently the Falcons senior defensive assistant, was also an analyst for Alabama the past 2 years, overlapping with DeMarcco Hellams. So this coaching staff has some familiarity with Hellams and how he works and whatnot. And so, he seemingly has the right makeup that this regime is looking for. And he needs that because he doesn't quite have the ideal athleticism that you want at that position. And that's evidenced in his relative athletic score, which is a 4.53 RAS, whatever you want to call it. And that was mostly due to him having poor agilities. He is like 7th percentile in 3-cone, 22nd percentile in the short shuttle, but he was 50th percentile when it came to his 40 time. And while, these are issues, I don't know if these are like major glaring issues because safety is kind of a neck up position, and we'll explore that a little bit deeper in the podcast. But like, it's one of those positions where I wouldn't say athleticism doesn't matter, but it is one of those positions where athleticism probably matters less at safety than it does pretty much any other position on the defensive side of the ball, because you can kind of compensate with your ability from the neck up. But again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But when I talk about the things I liked about DeMarcco Hellams' film, watching those 7 games this past year, the thing that consistently showed up was how sure a tackle tackler he is. He's a very reliable tackler. He consistently makes open field tackles. He's a wrap up, very good tackling technique, right? He did miss a couple of tackles, but most of those tackles were due to guys with a little bit more speed, able to kind of outrun his angles and left him sort of grabbing at dust rather than just like bad technique or not necessarily having the right size or anything like that. He does have the potential to be a striker, right? There were times watching the film where he'll line up a guy to deliver a hit, but he doesn't necessarily go for the highlight reel hits because he's much more like, I got to get this guy on the ground. So I'm going to be consistently wrapping up, where you see other players are just like, I'm going to line this guy up and take a shot at him. And that wasn't the case with DeMarcco Hellams. So I really like that. You like the physicality that he plays with. He's the type of guy that, you put an obstacle in front of him, like a 300-pound offensive lineman. He's going to go through that guy rather than go around that guy. And I like that type of mentality, especially at the safety position, right? He's a see ball, get ball type of player. And that manifests itself consistently when he's in run support, playing the run, where he can do less thinking and just play fast. And that's where he's at his best in the, as a run defender, because he can play that fast because he doesn't have to think, because he can just see the ball and go get the football, right? And that leads Hellams to me what his ideal role in the NFL. We'll talk about specifically where he fits in Atlanta a little bit later, but like his ideal role in the NFL is that sort of classic cover 3 strong safety, very similar to what Keanu Neal and Cam Chancellor were throughout their careers. That's a box run defender. That's not a guy that's you're going to ask to play a ton of deep stuff, right? Occasionally line up in the slot, cover tight ends and whatnot. He can cover the flat. He can cover the hook curl, right? But he's going to be that guy that can be that enforcer roaming the middle of your defense. And that's why I think I said on yesterday's episode that, like, if you could time travel and flip him and Jalen Hawkins, like, Hellams would have been the perfect draft selection in 2020 to be that sort of Keanu Neal enforcer when the Falcons were running that style of defense. But times are kind of a changing in the NFL, and I don't know if that type of safety is as in vogue, and that's going to be a challenge that DeMarcco Hellams is going to have to overcome, and we'll break that down, some of the other issues, particularly his issues in coverage, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, guys. But first, I want to tell you about Birddogs, who's providing you with super comfortable pants, shorts, and sweatpants. They have stretch khakis that are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg. They give you that truly sculpted look so you can show off your gains, because I know you guys don't skip leg day. You're just like Mike Davis and Bijan Robinson in that regard. And, they fit way better than regular shorts that are made of that stiff, restrictive cotton. And Birddogs invented a cloud knit fabric that looks just like a khaki but stretches, so you get a way slimmer fit without having to sacrifice movement. That's going to help you on those squats and whatnot. And so they also have that anti-stink sweat wicking fabric. It's going to keep you cool and dry all day long. That's especially good this summer. I like Birddogs because they have built-in liners as well. And that keeps everything, and I mean everything, guys, nice, snug, and cozy. So try them yourself by going to birddogs.com/LockedOnNFL, and you'll get a free Yeti-style tumbler with your order. That's birddogs.com/LockedOnNFL for that free Yeti-style tumbler. You won't want to take your Birddogs off. We promise you. So we're talking about DeMarcco Hellams being this ideal fit as this sort of cover 3 box strong safety, right? And, we've talked a lot over this podcast, and you've heard probably elsewhere that, teams are moving away from the cover 3 style defense. Now, it's not because the cover 3 is dead in the NFL. There's still plenty of teams that still run a lot of cover 3. It absolutely is a worthwhile coverage in the NFL. But gone are kind of the days where you have what the Falcons used to be when it was Ricardo Allen, Keanu Neal, or the Seahawks famously with Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor, where you have one safety that's a single high cover safety, and then you have one safety that is a box strong safety, right? Where you have that dichotomy, right? There are plenty of teams in the league, the Falcons included. They were one of like the top 3 or 4 teams in terms of cover 3 uses last year, but it wasn't because one Richie Grant or Jalen Hawkins was one or the other. They were interchangeable, and that's really what teams are going towards, to kind of be less static on the back end. Like Miami did that with Javon Holland and like Eric Rowe being the box guy, but now they're getting Vic Fangio, so they're going away. I think they ran the most cover 3 in the league last year. So it's basically like Gus Bradley's like the only guy that's still keeping that intact. And I don't even know if the Colts are going to even do that style of defense this year with their safeties that they have. So we'll sort of see. And that's the challenge going to be for a player like Hellams. Like, he's going to be the type of safety that you want to limit how much he plays deep, right? You want him to be that pure box safety. And you could see a scenario in Atlanta because of the presence of Jesse Bates, where Jesse Bates can be that single high safety and Hellams could be that pure box safety and have that similar dynamic that we had with Ricardo Allen and Keanu Neal. But it doesn't feel like the Falcons want to take that approach. They don't want to be that static and predictable in the back end where you know exactly where each safety is going to be, right? Not to mention what we talked about earlier this week, where it doesn't seem like the Falcons they're also headed towards dialing back their cover three. So you do question a little bit the fit that DeMarcco Hellams has in Atlanta, at least in terms of his potential to be a starter. We'll talk a little bit later about, him still being able to carve out a role as a role player here in Atlanta, despite some of these limitations. But those limitations really manifest themselves in coverage, right? And it's because Hellams is not really a great instinctual or anticipatory safety, right? And because of his average athleticism and speed or whatnot, he tends to react rather than anticipate plays. And that's led to the struggles in coverage, where you can see him thinking in coverage and he's reacting slowly, right? And this gets back to the whole conversation of the safety being a neck up position, right? Where you can be an okay athlete, but if you're anticipating things, then you can overcome that, right? And that's what Ricardo Allen was an average athlete, but because he was a smart, anticipatory player that was recognizing route concepts and all these various things, right, he was able to overcome the fact that he was, maybe an average or limited or below average athlete. And so you need to see a player like Hellams kind of develop that in order to get by in coverage. And he isn't quite there yet. Now, when it comes to him covering tight ends and being more of a man coverage guy, similar to what Keanu Neal was at his peak when he was that tight end eraser for the Atlanta Falcons, Hellams can get by in coverage and man coverage. He's a guy that can keep things in front of him. He'll be a guy that can close on the ball quickly, make the tackle, prevent yak and whatnot. But he's not really a guy that's going to be blanketing guys. He's not going to necessarily be contesting throws. And especially when you get the jumping competition with the types of receivers that he's going to face in the NFL, the types of tight ends in the NFL, like he's not going to really be that valuable in coverage. You'll be able to find better options to cover those tight ends, to cover those slot receivers. And again, that limits how effective he can be in coverage. And you saw this past year in that Tennessee game where he got matched up a couple of times against Jalen Hyatt, and Jalen Hyatt cooked him. And that speed disparity is only going to get magnified in the NFL. Now, not every team has a guy with Jalen Hyatt's type of speed. Now, I know Jalen Hyatt didn't run the fastest 40, but you see it on film that Jalen Hyatt moves different. But most NFL teams, pretty much every NFL team has at least a receiver or two that runs a sub 4.4, right? And so that type of speed, again, maybe not quite to the Jalen Hyatt level, but very fast speed is going to be something that if Hellams becomes a starter, he's going to see on a weekly basis. And I think that's going to lead to issues for him at the next level. Right. And, I think the thing that you're hoping to happen with DeMarcco Hellams, if you're the Falcons, and you're hoping that he can just kind of be a sponge in that safety room with Jesse Bates, with Richie Grant, with the other guys, just kind of in the back of the room, watching those guys break down film so that he can develop that anticipatory, because he puts in the work in the film room. And so he starts to understand and recognize those coverages and start to anticipate those things. And if he can do that, I think a few years down the road, he can, get closer to that Ricardo Allen type of player that is, capable in coverage. Now, obviously, Allen brought a little bit more in man coverage because of his background as a corner in college, but like a guy that can kind of just get by, right? That he can react quicker, recognize things, and so he can play faster in coverage than he does currently. And I think Hellams has that potential, but you just have to see that developing, at this point in time. It's a legit question. And I think what you're hoping for, that, a couple of years of sort of being that sponge in the film room, he gets to year 3, year 4 here in Atlanta, he's developed enough, right, that that work that he's put in pays off for him, that in the event, he's probably not going to be a starter here in Atlanta, right? But he's going to be a guy that if your starter does go down and you have to plug and play with DeMarcco Hellams for like a month because your starter has a high ankle sprain or something like that, you feel comfortable with DeMarcco Hellams being that plug and play fill-in starter for you, that stopgap starter, right? Your defense is not going to be as good as it would be with a more versatile player, but your defense is not going to suddenly break because you're, got DeMarcco Hellams. Maybe you have to adjust a little bit, play a little less cover 2 and play a little bit more cover 3 to be better suited towards his style of play. But he can function as a sort of replacement level starter, in the scheme with that development. But he's not there yet. The potential is there, but we'll just have to sort of see if that skill set can develop, if he can put in the time. And again, if you believe in, the makeup that he has, this coaching staff may think that he has that ability. But that is a perfect jumping off point to get us into the discussion of some NFL player comparisons, where we talk about what exactly is DeMarcco Hellams' floor, his ceiling, and his eye level, and what he can become not only in the NFL, but here in Atlanta. We'll talk about some players. And of course, I got to get one former Falcon comp in there. And so we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, guys. But first, I want to give another shout out to my everydayers out there, and we'll be getting into some interesting topics next week. We'll have some guests as well, in addition to doing that final film breakdown of Javon Gwynn. So you want to continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen, not only this week but next week. Subscribe to it on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. So wrapping up today's episode, let's talk floor, ceiling, eye level. And again, for those of you that are new here, I do these player comparisons, trying to find comparable athletes and comparable players that had careers that project to what I think a player is coming into the league. That's his floor immediately in the NFL. What his ceiling is, sort of the best case scenario for what that player can develop long term. And then the eye level is halfway between those 2 points, where presumably that's going to be the more accurate projection, where you're going to get some development, but you may not necessarily get all, check all the boxes to get that best case scenario that ceiling is. So starting out with DeMarcco Hellams' floor, got to give, the Falcon comp here. That's Sherrod Niesman. Longtime listeners of this podcast know I have a very soft spot for Sherrod Niesman. I spent 2019 on this podcast complaining about why isn't Sherrod Niesman getting a shot to replace an injured Keanu Neal at that strong safety position. Now, Niesman was a far better athlete than DeMarcco Hellams is, and so that's where the comp doesn't quite hold up. But Niesman also wasn't the most instinctual player. He was that see ball, get ball type of player. But the reason why I'm making this comp is because coming into the league, like Sherrod Niesman, a very competent contributor on special teams, a backup player, right? I think Hellams can be that similar type of player, even if he doesn't have the upside, the athletic upside that a player like Niesman had. And we saw Niesman kind of peak in 2018, sort of late in that season, filling in for an injured Keanu Neal. Then the Falcons kind of tried to transition him to be more of that deep safety backup to Ricardo Allen. And while he was fine when he got opportunities, it clearly wasn't a great fit. And, he didn't last too much longer outside of Atlanta, in part due to, the transition that the rest of the league is undergoing and whatnot. And so like, we'll sort of see if, Hellams can be that type of player immediately, but I think he can be. He's primarily a capable depth piece, but probably not your ideal sort of starter, but can contribute on special teams. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, my ceiling comp for DeMarcco Hellams is James Ehedebo, probably a player that many of you guys don't know, but Ehedebo was kind of a journeyman player, started a couple of seasons in the NFL, played the better part of a decade, I think, with 5 different teams across a decade. Started out his career playing special teams as an undrafted free agent with the Jets back in like 07 or 08. Spent a couple of years there as a reserve special teams, a very good special teams player there. Then he wound up being a starter for the Patriots in their Super Bowl season, with their near perfect season in 2011. And then moved on to Baltimore, played under both Bill Belichick and Dean Pease. Then after Baltimore, went to Detroit, and then probably bounced around a couple other places that I'm forgetting. And he did start for Bill Belichick and Dean Pease, and, embodied that do your job mantra that they were looking for in the starters. But in all those cases, right, of Ehedebo being a starter, the very next year, all those teams, the Patriots, the Ravens, and the Lions, all upgraded their position. And that's kind of what Ehedebo was, right? He's an effective downhill box safety, but a limited coverage guy. He'll do his job. Hellams has that similar background coming from that Nick Saban Alabama defense, understands that mantra of do your job. And I could see Hellams developing into this Ehedebo type of player. But the only reason he's starting games like Ehedebo did a couple of times in his career was because those teams didn't have better options. It's not because they purposely were like, who's going to be a really good starter for us? James Ehedebo. That's not going to be really the case to me with DeMarcco Hellams, right? He's the type of guy that if he starts a full season, the very next year, just like it was in New England and Baltimore and other places, that they're going to use an early round pick in the draft to upgrade that spot, or spend free agent dollars to upgrade that spot. And so I could see Hellams turning into a solid role player that plays the better part of a decade, and can be in a functional emergency starting option, but is not going to be that ideal option in terms of what I think his ceiling can be. Now, the eye level for DeMarcco Hellams is Another player that probably many of you guys don't know is Eddie Pleasant, right? He was a Oregon player, sort of undersized, but sort of physical, hard-hitting safety. A decade ago at Oregon, was an undrafted free agent for the Texans, I think starting out in 2012. Spent several years playing special teams and turned into a decent backup for them. It was years 4 through 6 when he was with Houston. He saw increased snaps on defense as sort of a backup dime safety. I think he wound up starting like 1 or 2 games in his NFL career, but in that dime safety role, he played primarily in the box. And I could see Hellams developing into that type of safety where you can use him in the dime, play him in the box. And, the Saints were a team under Dennis Allen that played a lot of dime relative to most teams in the league. And that's something that we suspect that Ryan Nielsen will port over here with the 3 safety looks from guys like Bates and Grant and Hawkins this year. And you could see certainly next year, if and when Hawkins moves on, we talked about that on yesterday's episode, if this is Hawkins' final year in Atlanta, you could see Hellams kind of slide into that 3rd safety role as that dime safety. And the thing about dime, where you have 6 defensive backs, it differs it from nickel, and primarily teams play dime exclusively in passing situations because the potential vulnerability of having, replacing 2 linebackers in your base defense with 2 defensive backs in your dime defense, right? So you're going to have a liability against the run, but you like to have in that dime defense because of the potential. Again, primarily it's a passing situation, passing down formation, but like the potential if a team runs it, you want to have one of those safeties comfortable playing in the box. And that to me is what Hellams is, like that dime safety that you have Bates and Grant or whoever else playing deep, but you put Hellams in the box next to Troy Anderson, next to Caden Ellis, whoever the linebacker is in those looks. And you will be fine, comfortable with him being that run support, dime safety, right? That basically functions as a linebacker, even if he's, quote unquote, undersized for that role. And I think Hellams could fit well in that. And that's kind of where my eye level projection for him. That's what Eddie Pleasant was in Houston many years ago. I could see Hellams being that type of player. That's my projection for him. That also contributes on special teams. And, for those of you that want to get a deeper insight into DeMarcco Hellams but don't have the time to watch 7 games, you only really need to watch 2 games of DeMarcco Hellams, right? You watch the Tennessee game, you watch the Mississippi State game, back-to-back games, right? The Tennessee game was his worst graded game this year by PFF. The Mississippi State game was his highest graded game back-to-back years. The Tennessee game basically showcases all the weaknesses of DeMarcco Hellams, the struggles in coverage, the limitations in coverage, right? That deep safety stuff, matching up against speed. He missed a couple of tackles, again, mostly due to being guys having outrun his angles, not because he's a poor tackler. And then you have the next week where he comes back and plays his best game of the season, where he's much more of that downhill run safety. And he's just smacking dudes in that Mississippi State game. And you see him make a couple of plays in coverage. That's the best version of DeMarcco Hellams. But again, I don't know if that type of safety is something that is really in vogue in the NFL. There's only a handful of places that seem to be coveting that type of safety. And I don't know if Atlanta's going to be that place, right? Again, as a dime box safety, I could see Hellams having a role here in Atlanta, but anything more than that, you might be, I don't know if Atlanta's going to get more than that out of him. And so the thing I like about Hellams is in this kind of contrast with Clark Phillips and why I'm not as enthusiastic about Clark Phillips's potential here in Atlanta as others is because at least Hellams has the special teams ability to fall back on. Like I don't project Clark Phillips as a high level special teams player. So if Clark Phillips doesn't carve out a role as a starter in the nickel or whatever, like I don't see him sticking long-term here in Atlanta, but I could see Hellams, even though he's not a starter, sticking long-term in Atlanta because I see him projecting well to special teams. He has that sort of mentality that you like on special teams. He kind of plays with his hair on fire, but he's not out of control. He's not a wild man. He's like controlled fire, right? Like his hair is on fire. And he's also a really good tackle. And so that projects well to being a special teams guy on punt coverage and all that stuff and more. And that's going to be something that he can hang his hat on and allow him to succeed in the NFL, even if he doesn't necessarily live up to expectations as a defensive playmaker. If that coverage ability doesn't really develop for him moving forward, he'll always have that fallback on. And all 3 of these players I compared him to, Niesman, ahead of Bo, and Pleasant, all were very valuable special teams players, were reliable special teams players, and that's why all of those guys were able to play like 5, 6, and then ahead of Bo's place case, 10 years in the NFL, because they could always fall back on that special teams ability early on, especially, that allowed them the opportunities to learn and develop and grow into the players that they were eventually, once they got to year 4, year 5, year 6. And so we'll just sort of have to see if Hellams can kind of follow suit on that. But a player that certainly has value to the Falcons defense, but may not have special, that starting upside, right? But again, I don't think that's a problem for a 7th-round pick. If he winds up just being a solid special teams player for the next 4 years, that's a win for a 7th-round pick, right? Not everybody has to be Jamal Anderson, the running back, Jason Snelling, or Kamal Ishmael is another great example of a quote unquote limited run support safety, wound up moving the linebacker, similar type of player. So that's something that you're kind of hoping for with DeMarcco Hellams. So that is it, guys, with the DeMarcco Hellams breakdown. I hope you you're ready for one more of these things with Javon Gwynn next week. Don't know what day that will be. Hopefully it won't take me as long to get through that film of Javon Gwynn as it has taken me. I kind of hit a slump these last couple of this last week with DeMarcco Hellams. It was just like, it wasn't like it was bad to watch the film, but it was just like I just kept getting distracted. So we'll get to that. We'll probably also we'll have some interesting topics next week as well. There's a couple of other things on my mind that I can wax poetic about, like the rest of the NFC South, to kind of fill the time, because we're looking for things that kill time here as we gear up for training camp over the next month or so. But that's also a great opportunity for you guys to submit your questions to be answered on future episodes of the Locked On Falcons podcast. And of course, you can find where to submit those. Just search Locked On Falcons on pretty much any platform, whether that's Twitter or Facebook. You can check out the Discord, the link in the description below. Leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, or you can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. Guys, hope to hear your feedback, whether that's on DeMarcco Hellams or other topics. And continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. I hope you have a great weekend. And for your second listen, gearing up for this weekend, check out the Locked On NFL podcast. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every